On Life and Meaning is brought to you by Blumenthal Performing Arts, celebrating its 25th year presenting the best in the performing arts, sharing and employing the arts as a major catalyst to strengthen education, building community cohesiveness, and advancing economic growth. Further support is provided by Charlotte-Mecklenburg Library, one of America's leading urban public libraries, delivering exceptional services and programs with a mission to improve lives and build a stronger community. And by the Arts and Science Council, Charlotte-Mecklenburg's resource hub and lead advocate for the regional cultural community, providing culture for all.
That, I think, catapulted everything, right? Sometimes it takes people years for that to happen, and it was my first job. But in that, there was a great insecurity because I never really had a professional mentor. I mean, I had faculty mentors, personal mentors, but a professional mentor to watch day to day as an executive. To this day, I have insecurities about it with all the experience that I've now had. And so I said to myself when I sat down at that desk, I said, I've got to look at everything like it's a cube. If I look at every side of the issue and I listen to a lot of advice, I will come up with the right answer or the right approach or the right way to go. And that's the way I am still today, even with over 30 years of experience as CEO of some important institutions. I still have that sense of insecurity.
Michael Marsicano is ranked by Charlottemagazine as the most powerful person in the city of Charlotte. He is president and CEO of the Foundation for the Carolinas, a Charlotte-based community foundation that advances philanthropy and drives major civic leadership initiatives. Prior to joining the foundation, Michael served as president and CEO of the Arts and Science Council in Charlotte and as executive director of the Durham Arts Council and the Royal Arts Center in Durham, North Carolina. He has served on the boards of several national and local organizations, from Americans for the Arts to Duke University. He has received numerous honors and awards, including the Charlotte Center City Partners Vision Award and the Charlotte Chamber of Commerce Innovator of the Year Award. In this episode, we explore economic opportunity and upward mobility, task forces, the complexity of grant-making, public criticism, and a career devoted to the arts, philanthropy, education, and citizenship. I'm Mark Paris, and this is On Life and Meaning. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you.
What is the Foundation for the Carolinas?
I have long tried to figure out an elevator talk about the foundation. It is very complex, and so there isn't a soundbite. I guess I would say that there are three types of foundations. There are private foundations, and most people understand those. Gates, Ford foundations. There are corporate foundations, like Bank of America, Wells Fargo. And then the third foundation is entitled a community foundation. They're public foundations. And they're really co-ops of multiple funds established by multiple different donors, families, nonprofits, corporations over time. And they all wrap up into this very large $2.5 billion asset foundation. And so we serve those fund holders to help them accomplish what they want to do in the community. And then we have some level of discretionary dollars that allow us to make decisions of where we think the community needs to go and help find others to join us in what I call a civic leadership role. So the two mission pillars are services to fund holders, building philanthropic capital goes along with that, and then civic leadership and civic engagement around important issues.
How does the foundation go about fulfilling those two dual missions?
Well, it's interesting. On the fund holders side, we function not unlike a bank, except that in this case, folks have charitable checking accounts. So we have significant size staff on the transactional side, where we are executing on donor preferences to send different nonprofit groups grants from those funds that they hold. Some of the funds have very specific missions like scholarships, where we're running competitive scholarship programs for those fund holders. So the service side is multifaceted. On the civic leadership side, we use that discretionary asset to engage the community in multiple different exercises, getting lots of people around the table. It's a very collaborative approach. We enter those topics neutral in our thinking. We draw on collective wisdom, and then we usually present a proposal to the community in one form or another to try to move a ball forward and see if funders can join us to move those projects ahead.
Michael, what are your strategic priorities at the moment?
Well, there's always a strategic priority of building philanthropic capital. More fund holders, new fund holders, expanded amounts of dollars going into those funds, convincing people that they should give ever-increasing amounts of their wealth to charitable causes.
Why is more important?
More is important for all sorts of reasons. The first is there's great need. We have so many issues that we need to move forward in this region, and resources fuel the moving of them forward. Money doesn't solve everything, but it certainly helps a lot. And I think that many people need to learn to be philanthropic. I don't think we come by it as a natural thing. So people of means need to be approached and convinced that sharing part of their benevolence is important to do. On the civic side, we have the strategic priority right now of economic opportunity and upward mobility. Over time, those strategic priorities change. They've moved everything from helping build greenways and trails to the cultural campus to Project Lift school reform. But right now, we're focusing on economic opportunity and upward mobility.
How is your time divided?
So I would say that 75% of my time is probably external to the walls of the foundation, meaning that while I'm the CEO, I'm only spending about 25% of my time working with my team. I've got great people that report to me who are very independently minded and work well independently. And that enables me to be external in working on community issues or working with philanthropic individuals or the city council or county commission to try to move some of the civic issues forward. And I would say that I probably spend more time on the civic issues than I do on the building of philanthropic capital, but I do both, and a lot of that's external work.
When you think of the city and this particular time in the city's history, how do you see your role in the community?
When you asked me earlier about the mission, and I said there were really two pillars, one, the philanthropic capital building, and the other, the civic leadership work, it wasn't always that way. The civic leadership work as a second pillar to our mission is really a decision that was made about 10 years ago to adopt it as a second mission. And it actually stems from the view that there was a significant void in leadership issues after what I would call the incredible benevolent decades of Mr. McCall. Charlotte, in particular, was very much led by corporate leaders. Government usually followed them. And suddenly we had a vacuum of corporate leaders who retired or were now running global companies. And the focus was not as much locally. And so the foundation actually started filling a void. And in that void, we tried a few, dipping our toes in the water, so to speak, on some major civic issues. We seemed to meet some success with them. And the board decided that our discretionary dollars were so small that they could go much further if we would get into the business of what I call civic leadership. And out of a vacuum, actually, and a dearth of resources that were discretionary, the combination of the two brought to us the second pillar of civic initiative, civic leadership.
Do you think of yourself as the person who succeeded Mr. McCall?
Oh, no. No one succeeds Mr. McCall, and Mr. McCall is at 82 a huge force in civic leadership. But he does not have, the full power of the bank behind him like he used to be able to make things happen. It is stunning to me that just on his sheer reputation, eloquence as a leader, that he is still making so much happen without having the bank at his fingertips. He obviously still is influential at the bank, of course. So you never can replace him.
Cities do have visionary leaders. In the absence of Mr. McCall being the CEO of the bank, do you think of yourself as a person who is filling that role?
So I think that I work with others to try to be a leader of our community. I don't think that anyone can fill the magnitude of his role during his heyday of work. So I count myself as one, but I would never claim myself as the. And I've always been puzzled by folks who might suggest the word visionary, because I don't know how many things that I have helped move forward were of my vision as much as bringing together the collective wisdom of others, where suddenly there's a blinding flash of what we should do, but it comes more from that collective wisdom than any internal visionary DNA gene that I might have.
Michael, I'd like to talk about some of the things you are moving forward. Mm-hmm. The Opportunity Task Force addressing economic mobility in Charlotte. Where are we in the effort to address the opportunity gap in the city?
So I would begin by saying that this topic, or these two topics, economic opportunity, upward mobility, are so complex that we are going to have to convince our community that we're talking decades of work. This is not Charlotte's comfort zone. Charlotte likes to see it has a challenge, put all its resources, both human capital and financial capital, toward it, get it done, and move on. This is one that is going to take a lot of sticking to it, and therefore patience. The Opportunity Task Force report was published last March. It's been a year. And there are many people who believe it hasn't been moved forward fast enough. The next generation leadership of volunteer leadership of the Opportunity Task Force, after the task force sunset their work, became the Opportunity Council, headed by Andrea Smith and James Ford. And it took a while to populate that council because leadership has changed very much in our community. It is very different from any other leadership body that's been created in its diversity in all ways. And so it's taken them a time to build social capital among themselves, to find the resources, which they recently did, to hire an executive director to start to help orchestrate the work. And I think you're going to see them moving quickly now. What I'm affirmed about with the work is that multiple individuals and institutions are picking up the recommendations and running with them. And I could go through a litany of examples of that. Everything from the entire city council's budget this year was shaped to show how it met the recommendations of the report. We're beginning to see some real energy toward affordable housing after all these years of false starts. You have the county commission investing significantly in early care and education. We haven't been able to get that going for years. And now they're talking about universal 4-year-old education. You've got Covenant Presbyterian Church deciding to allocate $2 million of faith dollars, so to speak, toward affordable housing. You have Michael Jordan giving $7 million for health care in our impoverished communities. So people are picking up pieces of the recommendation and they're running with it. And I think that's been terrific. So a long way to go, but a lot of examples of movement forward.
You referenced the Leading on Opportunity report, which I understand you helped write.
Yes, I that's a few words of mine in it.
What did you learn that you didn't already know?
Oh, wow. Guess I would say a huge learning from it, which could take us into a whole discussion, is how much of state policy issues are at play here that are controlled by the way our system of government is set up with a very dominant state constitution that limits municipalities from exercising resources or ordinances that could fast track a lot of the work that's in that report. That was probably the most striking issue for me. I certainly knew poverty exists. I certainly knew upward mobility was important. I certainly knew we needed more pre-K. I certainly knew we needed career and college readiness at a higher level than what we're graduating from high schools. We knew many of these things. The surprise to me was the obstacles in moving forward on them.
Michael, the foundation and you have been at this for about 3 years now. Mm-hmm. Is there anything you would do differently in retrospect?
I think what I would do differently is in response to one criticism of the report in particular. And that criticism has come from the sense that the economic and upward mobility issues of the Hispanic community were not very prominent in the report. There is a section in the report that talks about the greatest need there is preschool and bilingual education. And that is referenced there and what we need to do for the Hispanic community in that particular niche. But the greater question of service to Hispanic and other immigrant populations that are moving in, I think maybe the report could have weighed in more heavily in that area. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. We are now looking at that seriously in the next generation of work.
If Charlotte was ranked 48th or 45th out of 50 in the Harvard report on economic mobility, do you think our city would have responded the way that it has?
Mark, that's an excellent question. I think that I remember back to the 2000 or 2001 study that we were a part of that compared 40 cities on social capital, and we were very high in giving and volunteering and very high in a faith-based engagement. We were 39th out of 40 on interracial trust. And that also was a very low, and there was a great deal of energy around how do we move that to a different place. So I think the lower you go, the more Charlotte's bravado kicks in and says, we got to do something about this. I still think if it had been in that lower 10, it would have, but rock bottom just was a splash of cold water on the face of a lot of the current leadership and past leadership of Charlotte. What's interesting, though, I would say, is 50 out of 50 got us so much more fuel on it. But I would tell you the greatest fuel of the effort was the protests in September of last year, because then it was no longer just a study. It was visibly seen that we had an economic opportunity upward mobility challenge.
Let's talk about those protests just for a moment. Mm-hmm. Where were you when it happened, and what was your personal reaction to it?
So I was actually at the time renting an apartment. My wife and I were moving from a house where we raised 3 boys, large house, old house that we were over with. And we were downtown in an apartment complex for a few months while we were figuring out where we wanted to live after we sold our home. And so the protests were happening right out my window. And so I was both watching them on the news and watching them out my window. It was like an out-of-body experience. You were watching on the news like you normally watch these things, but then it was happening outside your window. And I was deeply troubled because the city was hurting. There was a tear, and the tear was deeper than I had known. And watching it play out in such a visible and dramatic way was very disturbing. So it actually made my commitment to the work that much greater.
I imagine the phone rang that night for you.
Yes, it did. Many folks were wanting to talk about what we could do immediately, as in tomorrow. And I don't know that any of us knew what to do. The first thing that we did do is felt that we needed to rally people to know that we had seen, but heard the pain. And the first thing we did do, and you may remember this, is we rallied we got on the phone, we called several people, and we said, we need to make a major statement. That major statement needs to say, we've heard you, we believe what you're saying is real. And that statement had thousands of people sign it and was published in the newspaper. So that was what we felt we could do out of helplessness at first, to make an important statement. And of course, then we continued to work on the economic opportunities study, which we've talked about.
Did you feel any particular emotional weight in response to it in terms of your position in the community?
Well, yes, I think that if you hold your agency up to be in a civic leadership position and the civic life of the community is having a troubling moment, you want to be able to respond. So yes, immediately I said to myself, what is the foundation going to do about this? How's it going to help?
Michael, I'd like to raise some criticisms of the foundation and have you address them in turn. 1, we don't need any more task forces. We don't need reports. We need startups experimenting with solutions.
So you may remember, Mark, that editorial writer to the newspaper published a piece that called into question the effectiveness of task forces and that we needed action and we didn't need to discuss anymore. We didn't need to debate. We didn't need to analyze. We needed to just move the ball forward with action items. And the analogy was startup companies. I wrote a response to that, suggesting that on one level, the writer was correct, but on another level, I disagreed. Most startups fail. That's just a fact. I think the point was that you need both. You need to have the startups that don't fail have a great deal of research and data-based decision-making. And that's what I believe the task forces, at least coming out of the foundation, have tried to be. But you need to pair those with the action-oriented efforts that the writer was talking about. And so I don't think we need fewer task forces. We just need more energy on picking up those research efforts and running with them. In that sense, I agree with her. Because we are not a service provider to the community, it would take us out of our lane if we actually started running pre-K programs, as an example. That's not what we're going to do. So we have to help build the infrastructure of the action organizations to pair with the research that the task forces do. I'm trying to think of how many task forces in Charlotte have the reports that have emanated from them just sat, so to speak, on shelves. And when I think about the Blue Ribbon Commission that was put together to look at new cultural facilities, you have the cultural campus, named the Levine Center. The task force that created the notion to come up with an environmental initiative called the Carolina Thread Trail is now built 260 miles on the ground. I keep going through the task forces that I'm familiar with, and I see very much translation into action items. I can't say that for those that I might not know about, but most of them have translated into action items, even if all the action has not necessarily been completely successful.
Second criticism. Civic initiatives that the foundation leads further concentrates power at the foundation and stifles new leadership that is necessary for this region to prosper and mature.
Now that's very interesting. So I have to think about that, Mark. We have tried in the composition of all the task forces to bring new leadership into the leadership role of the work. And I think that the Economic Opportunity Task Force was an example of folks that were empowered with a leadership position by virtue of being on the task force that many of them had never had before. And I think the next generation leadership group, the Opportunity Council, is the same way. I mean, when have you ever seen one of the highest ranking corporate executives in America, and Andrea Smith, co-chairing with James Ford, a former teacher and very much a grassroots leader? So we've tried to adjust with the changing needs of leadership and with what we've tried to put together. Now, one could ironically say that in some ways that makes the foundation more influential because it has assembled an ever-increasing greater voice at the table. I don't know how to respond to that. If that's what that has done, would the alternative to not be to have a greater collective wisdom by who's on those task forces?
I think the criticism this is actually a criticism I raised several years ago when this second pillar was established. And I raised a concern that the solutions to city issues are top-down driven through this institution. And that stifles more creative grassroots responses from new leadership groups because they would otherwise have to come here to get their ticket punched and to be blessed and directed. So it actually ends up limiting future leaders who are creatively trying to find solutions in the community.
So this is actually really important. This is a really important question, Mark, and one that I have struggled with since you first brought it up. I know that we fund on the discretionary grant side, often startup entities to be able to approach things differently. That's not our civic leadership side. It's just simply our discretionary grant making side to try to enable those to take flight. Now, if you're saying that the persona of the foundation taking on an issue kind of sucks the air out of the room for other issues that we don't take on, I really have to think about that, because does that say then we don't take on issues? I mean, it's a challenging question because they're not meant to stifle any other. But if they're inadvertently stifling any other, then I've got to think about that.
Third criticism. Michael, you have families who have established philanthropic funds in their names at the foundation. One of your fund holders made a donation to an organization flagged by the Southern Poverty Law Center as a hate group. Should the foundation enable such donations?
So I suspected you would ask that question. So this question, Mark, is one that community foundations across the country are grappling with. I would begin answering the question by saying that grant making is very complex. I find it really interesting that people think that the foundation grant making is fun and easy. And it certainly can be very rewarding, but it's not fun and easy. And the complexity of grant making at a community foundation is particularly complex. There are really two lanes that the community foundation grant making walks down. And you've cited one of the lanes, which at Foundation for the Carolinas is the larger lane. And by that I mean where most of the money is granted out from, and that's fund holders who put money in from their family and then direct us to make grants. And we find that those fund holders, in a diverse big tent of fund holders, have political, religious views that are at the full ends of each spectrum and can be diametrically opposed. And in particular, in areas like immigration, pro-life, pro-choice, school reform, charter schools, the environment, LGBTQ issues, it is almost that sometimes their different divergent views actually negate each other by the nonprofits that they fund, because they fund completely different views of that subject through nonprofits, which brings us to the question of nonprofits. Nonprofits actually reflect in their work some of those different views along those political spectrums, right? So where our board has come down on this question is that if the IRS declares a nonprofit organization in its eyes as a legitimate 501c3 organization, which means it has to have passed a test of being illemisonary, charitable, or educational, that the board will make the grant to that nonprofit. The question you ask about, is an organization hate group, can be a question that is in the eye of the beholder as to whether it is a hate group or not. There are groups out there that people have completely different views of whether that nonprofit is a hate group, and yet it still has the charitable status to it. So right now, the board's position is that if a nonprofit has that IRS status, they do not believe they are in a position to override the legitimacy of that nonprofit status. There is a belief of our board that to some extent there is a freedom of speech issue here, that philanthropy is a form of freedom of speech. And then there is a particularly challenging issue on this topic, which is that when a community foundation has not taken the directions of the fund holder that put the money in their fund to be granted out, the community foundation in court has lost. That is to say, case law has said that donor intent with their fund overrides a variance power of the community foundation. So now we're into a legal issue. So this is my point about how complicated this is. And right now our board is where the IRS status, and there's not a layer above that in analysis as long as that organization is in good standing with the IRS.
How have other community foundations addressed this issue?
So this topic has been a recurring discussion at our board over years, but most frequently because of the question that you asked prior to this one, Mark. We did an analysis to see what were other community foundations doing. And if time permits, I'll share just a few of those examples. In Marin County, California, the community foundation asks every nonprofit to sign their statement that is an anti-discrimination statement. So they don't give a grant from a fund to a grantee unless the nonprofit has signed that. We looked at that. Well, if you have a nonprofit that somewhere along the way became morally corrupt, why would you think they just wouldn't sign it? So the board said, well, that isn't a sufficient layer of analysis to find out if this organization is morally bankrupt. We looked at New York Community Trust, which is a community foundation. And in New York, we found that they did have a layer above the IRS layer, but it was a layer that they affected with nonprofit groups, but gave donors a complete free rein on houses of worship. Well, we all know that there are houses of worship, for example, that are absolutely anti-LGBTQ. And when asked the question to the New York Trust, they said, well, the system's not perfect. Well, we thought that was almost a bit of hypocrisy. We then went and also found that the Dallas Community Foundation, it's actually called the Texas Community Foundation, but it's based in Dallas and serves, and they had the policy that we have at the moment. But they had talked about it and reviewed it and stuck with the IRS status as their policy. So community foundations are beginning to deal with this. There was another example on Silicon Valley where it had to do with a claim of a group to being anti-Muslim versus not being anti-Muslim. And it was actually blown up in the press in a big way. And I believe they stuck with what they enabled the fund holder to do, but I would have to give you more on that one. But it seemed like they were leaning toward the IRS status as the benchmark as well.
Is there a case where the foundation would deny a fund holder the ability to make a grant to a particular nonprofit organization?
I would have to believe that there would have to be an instance where there's a line for all this statement about a community tent that's big and that enables fund holders to be many political, religious beliefs, which is a core value of the community foundation. I would have to believe that there would be a line. I haven't seen it yet. I think if I saw it, I would want to take it to the board. I don't know what it looks like when I see it, but I am not willing to say that there isn't a line. Further complicating your question is that we give out 29,000 grants a year. How would we review every one of those grants for some kind of judgment above the IRS status? It's more likely that it would be brought to our attention in some way. And when those things are brought to our attention, we would certainly look into it.
One instance was brought to your attention. In your mind, was a line crossed?
With all that we know, we concluded that we would stick with the IRS status as I've defined.
Fourth criticism, Michael. The foundation is sensitive to public criticism. Anyone who challenges the foundation publicly does so at their own risk.
So let's start with my personal sense. Am I thin-skinned? I am, and I admit it. But I've always believed that that thin skin had me say, what are we doing wrong that we need to do right, rather than, well, what we're doing right is how dare anybody criticize. I have enough intellectual honesty, I think, and frankly enough insecurity to say if there's a criticism, I got to think about it. We might be doing something wrong. My staff will tell you that's how I approach everything. After I go through that self-analysis of the organization and what we're doing, I then ask myself, okay, if I've tried to be intellectually honest with myself and our agency has tried to be intellectually honest with itself, do I need to set a record that I think is being called into question right? And that was an example where, with the criticism you mentioned about startup versus task forces, I just, in everything I believe, see good in the task forces, at least that have come out of the foundation, in my belief, have led to good things. So I felt the need to defend that. It never occurred to me that folks would read that as they did and say that I was shouting down the writer, when in fact I complimented the writer for half of what she said, which calls in your very question that the personified influence of the foundation would not even have people read an editorial I wrote that was actually very fair to the writer. And that is a challenge for me to think about. What does that mean if the organization is perceived to be that influential? So I see the thin-skinned nature that I hold as a way to self-examination, not a way to defend the status quo of what we're doing.
The example you gave is not the only one we can think of. There are other instances where someone has gone on the record, questioned the foundation, and there's been often a quick and certain response. Be careful if you ever say anything or dare say anything where you're challenging the foundation, because you do it at your own risk.
So I admit to the thin-skinned in its CEO. Again, I'd like to believe that that has a good end result in self-evaluation of the merits of the criticism rather than just dismissing them. But I do think if records are being called into question, there should be a response. If they're aggressive, maybe people should read what I wrote and take my name off it and the foundation's name off it and evaluate, was this fair? What you're telling me is the foundation's name on it gives it so much more weight that it comes across as aggressive, when I don't think my language was.
I'd like to talk about Michael. Where did you grow up?
I was born and raised in St. James, New York, which is contiguous to Stony Brook, New York. And many people know Stony Brook because there's a university there. And that is on the North Shore of Long Island, which was at the time a very, very small town.
Tell me about your parents.
My father was the firstborn generation in an Italian immigrant family, the only one of 6 of his brothers and sisters to go to college, the youngest. And my mother was from a very different world. She was a Southern belle from the Birmingham, Alabama area. And they met in college. And my father moved my mother to what she thought would be the bright lights of New York. And I was raised in New York till I came to North Carolina.
Michael, how would your parents have described you as a child?
Oh, dear. How would they describe me as a child? I think that they would probably describe me as achievement-oriented. I did well in school. They instilled a great passion for the arts in me that I exercised early on by performing and doing other arts-related events. I've actually never had anybody ask me that question, how they thought of me. It's an excellent question. There wasn't much of a revolt nature in me. I remember not being able to wear blue jeans to school. And so I would take them in the morning and change them in gym class. And one day I forgot to change them on the way home. And I was taken to task. And I remember when my parents I wanted to grow my hair long because that's what you did in the early 70s. And I didn't just do it. I asked permission from my parents to do it. So I guess I was a fairly obedient child.
Michael, do we see you in jeans today?
You did not see me in jeans today.
I mean, do you wear jeans?
I do. And in fact, because I wear a suit at work, when we were running either the Arts and Science Council or the United Way campaign here with the employees, they asked if we could have a jean day and if I would wear jeans because no one believed that I would do it. So what I did was I have jeans, but I don't have a jean shirt or a jean jacket. So I bought a jean jacket. I was fully dressed in jeans. And so that's interesting because there is a sense, because of my suit and tie approach in today's world, that I'm a little stuffy. I will be quite honest. Many of the donors to the foundation are of an age that is used to that style. I think it's important for them to feel comfortable with me in talking about large sums of money, their charitable estates. And so I feel that's important to have folks feel comfortable with who they're talking with. But I do wear jeans.
Michael, who were you in high school?
Who was I in high school? I was an oboist. I was a varsity soccer player. I was a good student. I don't know who I was in high school.
You know, I'm curious because throughout your entire professional career, you've been the chief executive. And I'm wondering if that started early in life, whether you had those leadership skills and whether they showed themselves before you even started your professional career.
Well, I think I led some things in high school. I mean, nothing dramatic, but I did. I think that going to college was probably the more transformational experience for me. I went to Duke, and Duke was a transformational experience for me in so many, many ways. And I did pursue some leadership opportunities as an undergraduate. When you stay at a university for all three of your degrees, you're often tapped then. So when Terry Sanford, who was president at the time, was tapping, by then I was in graduate school, graduate students to be on university task forces or university committees, which always have students, because of my undergraduate history and knowing the school, I was an easy tap. And so that gave me opportunities to be in a room with a group of very accomplished trustees to watch how things get done. And so I do think there were shaping experiences at Duke that maybe moved me along a little quicker. But the shocker was my first job, and that was the Arts Council in Durham. And they hired me as the executive director of a full team of staff and a significant budget and a building of a new arts center that was about to happen. And I had never had a full-time job, much less been the CEO of the organization. I remember when I got the job and I sat in my desk and I looked at my desk and I said, now what do I do? So that, I think, catapulted everything, right? Sometimes it takes people years for that to happen, and it was my first job. But in that, there was a great insecurity because I never really had a professional mentor. I mean, I had faculty mentors, personal mentors, but a professional mentor to watch day to day as an executive. To this day, I have insecurities about it with all the experience that I've now had. And so I said to myself when I sat down at that desk, I said, I've got to look at everything like it's a cube. If I look at every side of the issue and I listen to a lot of advice, I will come up with the right answer or the right approach or the right way to go. And that's the way I am still today, even with over 30 years of experience as CEO of some important institutions. I still have that sense of insecurity.
What do you attribute that to?
Well, some of that may be my personality makeup. I don't know. But I guess maybe the insecurity has been reinforced by the fact that it made me look at things in multiple ways to make sure that I didn't get it wrong or tried not to get it wrong, and therefore it worked for me.
You came to Charlotte in 1989 and became president of the Arts and Science Council. And you led the organization for 10 years. What do you remember about your time at the ASC?
It was exhilarating because you had in my great mentor here, Hugh McCall, the iconic corporate leader who wanted to make the community move forward significantly in the arts. So his gravitas, resources, energy, ideas as a volunteer extraordinaire and a fundraiser and all of that, coupled with my professional work, was this 10-year ride of making things happen that just was terrific. And it was a huge growth period for the arts. But interestingly, in your questions about the influence of the foundation, after that 10-year period and toward the end of that 10-year period, the same criticisms were launched about the Arts and Science Council. It had a huge concentration of money for the arts. It was funding the arts organizations at a large level of money, and therefore its major funder. And this tension between the influence of that major funder, and yet we kept fueling the money every year to not only build the buildings, but to grow the annual budgets, welcome new groups like the Charlotte Ballet, which weren't here before. And yet I emerged out of that 10 years asking a similar question to myself that you've asked of me here today, and that is, did that concentration of resources there work for the community? My view was the arts grew dramatically because of it. So it was the growth of that that was just a great ride.
A few artist friends of mine who have grown up in Charlotte say that the arts in the 1970s and 80s were far more edgy and transgressive and interesting than it is now. That art in Charlotte became more institutional in the 1990s under your watch. What do you say?
So that's interesting, because when I got here in 89, my view of the arts fair at the time versus where I was in Durham, which was the institutions weren't nearly as big, but because of the academic dominance of Duke and Durham, the cutting edge material was there in the DNA of that community. And I came here and I found that we were not very cutting edge and not very avant-garde in a lot of our work. So it's interesting that there would be those that would think that it got worse during those years because I thought we were trying to get it to a better place. So I have to think about that. I will tell you that at least in the major institutions, I think their journey during those years to be more cutting edge work would be a true statement to say that they did. Now, did it suppress a grassroots arts community that maybe I wasn't as aware of it suppressing because the dominance was funding the major groups? That could be a fair criticism.
During your entire professional career, you've been a chief executive. Mm-hmm. Could you work for someone else?
That is a very thought-provoking question. Well, I'm 62 now, so my runway is 5 more years, and I don't know that that would be my choice today. Could it have been anywhere along the way? Sure, I could have worked for someone else. Right now, I don't know that that's what I'd want to do.
Michael, you've been listed as the most powerful person in Charlotte. How do you feel, and what does that mean to you when you read that?
I don't think it's true. I don't think it's true for lots of different reasons. I think I'm a visible leader right now. I think that is true. It makes me feel, on the one level, proud that people would think I was that influential. On the other level, it makes me motivated to try to meet expectations. And on another level, I think it's the craziest thing I've ever read.
In 3 or 4 years' time, whenever you might retire, the foundation will have more than $3 billion in assets, maybe over 100 employees. If you were to hire the next president of the foundation, what would you look for in that candidate?
Well, of course, it won't be my decision, but I think it is going to be a very interesting question for the board. And I think the question for the board relates to the beginning of our interview, which is the two pillars. The money will be so large, the need to make sure it's invested well, the IT needs around all that, the legal issues related to all of that. Will they go with someone who is more oriented toward that, what we would consider in a more corporate executive mode? Or will they go on the civic leadership side of the equation, which is someone who is much more knowledgeable about community and civic work and civic affairs? Because at some point, the discretionary dollars with the state gifts to the foundation will give it far more discretion than it has now. Right now, everything we do is leveraged by others joining us because the discretionary dollars are modest. I think they're going to have a really interesting debate on that. Can they find someone who has got marriage of those two traits and talents? That would be ideal. I think I have a little of both, but I don't know that I have in me enough of both that you would hire me 5 years from now. And my worry is that they might pivot one strong way over another. And what does that do to the other side of the equation?
If Duke University called you and asked you if you would be their next president, would you say yes?
Well, Duke University won't call me to do that because I just finished being on the search committee for a brand new president at Duke University who is extraordinary and will be there for, we hope, at least 10 years. I love Duke University. If you could have said to me that along the way in my career, Duke University would have offered that to me, there is no question that I would have loved to have done something like that. Why did it never occur to me that I could do something like that? Because Duke will always hire a person of great scholarship, and that is not my background. There was a time in Duke's life, for instance, with Terry Sanford, where they needed a top administrator to fuel the fundraising and the executive leadership. The position that Duke holds now, though, is it's got several people who can do that on its team. They will never not have in their lead role someone of great scholarship. Would I love for that to have been part of my life? Absolutely. Would that have ever happened? Not without me having pursued a scholarship agenda from my work.
What do you value most, Michael?
So I value integrity, I think, more than anything. But paired with that, I've always used this term, and I've used it far earlier than people started thinking about fake news and fake facts and alternative facts and all of that, and that is intellectual honesty. I try to see that I have enough of an internal compass to be intellectually honest with myself about things, and my greatest value in the other people that I work with is, do they have intellectual honesty about themselves and about what they're promoting and what they're working on? So integrity and intellectual honesty, I think, would be the things, at least in other people, that I value the most.
Thank you for your time today, Michael.
Thank you.
Michael Marsicano is president and CEO of the Foundation for the Carolinas, a Charlotte-based community foundation. He earned a bachelor's degree in psychology and a master's degree and a Ph.D. in education from Duke University. And now, a personal word. Before my conversation with Michael for this podcast, I've had one or two discussions with him over the years, and not for very long. They may have totaled a combined 10 minutes. The foundation was one of many sponsors of Charlotte Viewpoint, a civic and cultural magazine I founded, and Michael wrote 2 articles that Charlotte Viewpoint published, one in 2007 entitled The Kindness of Strangers, and one in 2009 entitled The Foundation for the Carolinas' Response to the Economic Crisis. My interactions with him for those articles were primarily through intermediaries. When I did talk with him, he was always gracious and complimentary of my efforts. But there was one exchange with Michael that changed the dynamic, at least for me. In 2007, the foundation announced its expansion into civic leadership. I wrote an article entitled Questioning the Foundation. In the article, I expressed concern about how formal civic leadership initiatives at the foundation would further concentrate power at the foundation and would limit the growth of grassroots leadership in the city. I wrote my article at the same time Charlotte Viewpoint was eligible for additional funding from the foundation. I sent in my grant application. Michael and his team called me into the foundation offices and let me know they were unhappy with my article. My funding request was denied. It felt retaliatory. I don't know if Michael had anything to do with the decision, but it soured how I felt about the foundation. The conversation I had with Michael for this podcast was my first discussion with him in 10 years. I knew an archive of significant voices in Charlotte would not be complete without him. I asked a friend at the foundation if Michael would be a guest. I was informed that he would. I read articles and watched videos about him, excited about the opportunity to connect with him on a personal level. Here is what impressed me: his absolute humility and candor in answering uncomfortable questions that criticized him and the foundation. We talked on and off the record for 2 hours, and again in a lengthy late-night phone call that he initiated, and I was taken by his transparency, his internal questioning, and his interest in my ideas and concerns. He modeled the very trait that he values most: intellectual honesty. Intellectual honesty is a willingness to question one's own assumptions and acknowledge that reasonable alternative viewpoints exist. It recognizes one's own weak points and notes the good points made by others. It addresses the merits of an argument instead of attacking the person making the argument. It is a commitment to critical thinking. It seeks to clarify and understand what is true. With the exception of Hugh McCall Jr., retired president and CEO of Bank of America, Michael Marsicano is the single most significant person in Charlotte's history over the last 30 years. His record is stunning. During his tenure at the Arts and Science Council between 1989 and 1999, the United Arts Fund grew to lead the nation in per capita giving and became one of the largest endowed arts councils in the United States. Those monies flowed into major arts institutions, museums, and public art that fueled Charlotte's burgeoning cultural scene. Arguably, his most significant accomplishment at ASC is how he navigated controversy over the Charlotte Repertory Theater's production of Angels in America. His decisions helped preserve artistic expression in the city and public funding of the arts. It was a defining moment for our region and a story that Michael is destined to tell. During his nearly 20 years leading the Foundation for the Carolinas, he has grown assets under management from several $100 million to over $2.5 billion. Under his leadership, the foundation has grown from the 35th largest community foundation to the 6th largest in the nation. The foundation has facilitated billions of dollars of grants to charitable organizations. However, the significance and impact of the foundation goes far beyond the numbers. Here are just a few initiatives Michael has launched. The Lusky Gorelick Center for Philanthropy that helps nonprofit groups throughout the city do their work. The Robinson Center for Civic Leadership that convenes partners and funders to address the region's greatest needs. The Away Home Endowment addressing the affordable housing crisis. The Critical Need Response Fund that helps sustain nonprofit organizations during the Great Recession. Project Lift that is educating and empowering thousands of underserved students. The North Tryon Vision Plan that is catalyzing 60 acres of uptown Charlotte. The restoration of the long derelict Carolina Theater and building of a new iconic hotel tower that will grace the skyline. The Opportunity Task Force and leading an Opportunity Council addressing deeply embedded issues of economic disparity and upward mobility. Any one of these accomplishments is worthy of note. All of them is a towering achievement. Michael Marsicano has strengthened the Charlotte region beyond measure. This is Mark Paris, and you've been listening to On Life and Meaning. Additional support for this podcast is provided by the UNC College of Arts and Architecture, celebrating a decade of creative education in the arts and design. Thank you to our funding partners, and to my teammates, Andy Go, producer of the show, and to Chris Curriton, art and media director. This is how you can help. Please write a review on iTunes. It helps us grow our audience. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We'd love to hear what you think about the show. And become a patron. We are on Patreon, a crowdsourcing platform that allows you to support what you value at a level you choose. Visit us also on our website, onlifeandmeaning.com. Thank you for listening.